On this episode of Broad Scale Modeling, we look at beginning paintwork and weathering on Bandai's AT-AT. I begin by priming the model in black Stynylrez primer. This primer is an acrylic water-based primer and pretty much the only acrylic primer worth a damn. It's also repackaged as Ultimate Primer from Ultimate Modeling Products and MIG Ammo One-Shot Primer from MIG Ammo. It adheres excellently, is very durable, and is sandable after it's cured for a couple of hours. Even though I will be using Vallejo Model Air paint later in this video, I would not recommend Vallejo's primer. It's just not very good and you'll probably regret it. If you prefer lacquer primers, use Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black in place of Stynylrez. It's also an excellent primer. The first thing we need is some distilled water and some flow improver. I use Liquitex FlowAid, which I bought from Hobby Lobby with a 40% off coupon. There are other brands of flow improver, it just happens Liquitex was the easiest for me to find. The reason we need flow improver in our water is that if we airbrush the water straight out, it will beat up on the surface terribly and we want a nice, glass smooth surface of our water. If you don't have a FlowAid, you can also try a couple of drops of dishwashing liquid to break the water's surface tension. Finally, we need salt. Because of the small scale of this model, I'm going to use salt packets I picked up from McDonald's. The reason I use these instead of normal table salt is that McDonald's salt is more fine-grained and works nicer at this scale. You can use normal kitchen salt if you want, but I recommend trying to find a smaller grain salt if you can. Use it as an excuse to break your diet on an order of French fries, why not? So to start, add 1 part flow improver to 20 parts water. With flow improver, a little goes a long way, so you don't want to add too much thinking that more will be better. Begin by spraying the surface in nice, easy, controlled passes. You want the surface to gloss up and be reflective. This indicates there is enough water on the surface to make the salt adhere. After you've finished one side, shake some salt onto the surface from high up as you can. The higher up you are, the more the salt will spread out and become random. I used a mixing cup to spread mine, but perhaps an actual salt shaker would have worked better. If you accidentally drop too much salt in one area, you can wipe it off with your finger or a paintbrush. If this now leaves the area too bare, simply respray some water and then reapply the salt. Continue this process around the model, taking your time and being careful not to dislodge already attached salt. Once you are done, set the model aside to dry for at least 1 hour and a little more if possible. The salt will appear clear while wet, but once fully dry will be white. Once your model looks like this, you are ready to begin the painting steps. We want to start spraying various colors of gray tones to break up the monotone flat surface. Pick a dark gray, a medium gray, and a white. The exact colors don't really matter, it's just to add variation. I'm using Vallejo Model Air here, but any good paint will do. Randomly spray areas with your dark gray first. Do this in very light coats and have patience. Do not flood the surface with paint or the salt will soak up the water or liquid carrier in the paint and leave a horrible finish. Just use light coats to build up opacity. Repeat this step with both the medium gray and the white. It's even okay to overlap a bit. Set this aside to dry for at least 2 hours and overnight if you're not in a hurry. Once it is dry, it's time to remove the salt. Take the model part to a sink and use a soft bristled toothbrush running the model under the water to scrape the salt off. Be gentle as you do not want to be rough with it or you might risk damaging the paint. Once all the salt is removed, you will have a finely modeled looking surface that will serve as a starting point for our weathering. Now we move on to apply the base coat. The original AT-AT studio models were painted with Floquil SP lettering gray. Unfortunately, Floquil is no longer produced, so we need a substitute. If you aren't picky, any medium gray will probably be close enough. If you are picky, we have a few options. Many third-party paint companies have tried to fill the vacuum left by the discontinuation of Floquil paints. One such company is Archive X, precisely formulated to match the studio Floquil paints used in Star Wars films. It doesn't get better than Archive X for perfect accuracy. However, a couple of other options also exist. Badger produces a line of paints called Model Flex, which includes an SP lettering gray. The other option, which is what I'm going to do, is to mix up your own approximation. I'm going to use Vallejo Model Air Light Gold Gray. Because of the small scale of the model, this color alone might be too dark after weathering, so I'm going to lighten it up a bit. In the end, I mixed 3 parts Vallejo Model Air White Gray with 2 parts Vallejo Model Air Light Gold Gray. This gave me a very nice shade close to SP lettering gray. Once I had settled on this mixture, it was time to paint. I wanted this layer to go on nice and translucent as not to completely cover up the pre-modeling grime we did. I therefore thinned the paint with the following ratio: 2 parts Vallejo Model Air paint mixture, 1 part Vallejo airbrush thinner, and 1 part Vallejo flow improver. Normally you don't have to thin the paint this much, but I want to be very careful not to accidentally cover up my other work so far, so I want the paint to have a low opacity. Paint the model in even light coats using sweeping controlled strokes. Keep doing this until you've built up a base coat to a nice opacity and overall color while still being able to make out the pre-modeling we did underneath. It's better not to cover it up enough and then have to go back and cover it a little more than to go too far and completely obscure our work. Once you are happy with the look, it's time to move on to general discoloration weathering. And here is the result we get after the base coat. Some people become intimidated by weathering a model. The random chaotic nature of weathering can easily lead to a where do I even start type feeling. Therefore, I like to start with the broad strokes in the first step and then work my way down to the details in subsequent steps. Approaching the subject in this way makes it easier for me to break down the process into manageable pieces. In our first step, we are simply going to add in general discoloration. There is no detail work involved here, and so it is pretty easy. To make my oil paint wash, I simply dilute oil paint with an odorless terpenoid. I'm heavily diluting blobs of MIG oil paintbrushes here, but you don't have to. Normal artist oil paints will work just fine. Just go for some simple colors. Because Star Wars vehicle weathering tends to be fairly monochrome, I will just be using white, black, and Starship Filth as my colors. The first two are monochromatic, and the Starship Filth is a darkish gray with a warm tone to add just a hint of color to our weathering. MIG Ammo and Optilong 502 are the only brands I know of that make Starship Filth. If you are using artist oils, you can substitute Starship Filth with a Payne's Gray and Burnt Umber mixed together. This will get you close enough. Also with artist oils, Titanium White and Ivory Black can be used instead of the MIG Ammo White and Black I'm using here. We start by taking a flat, wide paintbrush and dipping the tip in odorless terpenoid. Gently wipe the wet brush across the surface you are about to weather. We want a shiny wet sheen, but don't want to flood the surface. While the surface is wet, take a small pointed brush and load the tip with black oil wash mixture. Simply tap the tip of the brush to random spots at the top of the model and let the wash flow down the surface. If the wash pulls anywhere, be sure to work it out with a brush so it doesn't leave an unnatural looking stain. Do this with your black oil wash all over the model. After you finish that, do the same thing with the white and Starship Filth washes but in different spots than the previous colors. It's okay if there is some overlap though. We are just trying to add tonal variation across the otherwise featureless flat surface. Once finished, set a box over the model for the paint to dry at least 24 hours before we begin the next step. This concludes part 1 of weathering an AT-AT. Part 2 will deal with more detailed weathering such as oil streaks, oil stains, rust stains, general fine detailed grime, and paint chipping. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them below. I am Daniel Broadway and I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial.